Iran looked peripheral to the war until the summer of 1941 revealed how suddenly it could become essential. What began as a distant conflict in Europe now pressed against its borders through diplomacy, fear, and the fast-moving collapse of the Soviet front. By August, as German forces surged toward Leningrad, Kiev, and the Volga, Allied planners faced a logistical dilemma. If the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics fell, the balance of the entire war would shift, and without a safe route for aid to reach Soviet territory, collapse no longer seemed impossible. That urgency would soon reshape Iran's fate. The country had spent the 1930s pursuing a careful neutrality under Reza Shah Pahlavi, expanding railways, strengthening authority, and navigating between British and German influence. Tehran resisted, becoming a pawn in great power rivalry. Yet the pressure grew as Berlin built commercial links and military advisors. By 1941, British officials feared that Iran's neutrality hid a lean toward Axis interests, whether intentional or simply structural. The stakes sharpened when intelligence suggested German agents could use Iran as a corridor toward India or the Caucasus. To London and Moscow, uncertainty itself had become dangerous. In the final week of August, the Allies moved. On 29 August 1941, British and Indian divisions advanced from the south, while Soviet forces pushed in from the north, beginning what Tehran would later call the Three-Week War. Resistance was limited, but tense Iranian commanders understood the imbalance, but still defended key towns and rail links. By mid-September, the outcome was clear. Under growing military pressure and diplomatic isolation, Reza Shah abdicated on 16 September, passing the throne to his son, Mohammad Reza, whose authority would depend heavily on managing the uneasy presence of two occupying powers. For the Allies, the campaign had two main objectives: to prevent suspected Axis influence from taking root, and to secure the Trans-Iranian railway as a strategic supply route. The railway, completed only 6 years earlier as a major symbol of national modernization, stretched from the Caspian Sea in the north to the Persian Gulf in the south. But in 1941, its capacity was limited roughly 1 million tons per year under peacetime conditions, with steep slopes and tight curves restricting locomotive performance. It was not a system built for global war. Yet the urgency of the Eastern Front forced a quick reassessment. The British stabilized the southern ports. The Soviets secured their northern receiving zones, and both pressured the new Iranian government to guarantee transportation rights. Iran, caught between necessity and force, agreed to terms that allowed wide Allied control over rail, road, and communications infrastructure. The country remained formally sovereign, but much of its logistical backbone was now in foreign hands. Even at this early stage, the realities of the task became clear. Ports at Khorramshahr and Bandar Shapur were small, shallow, and strained by heat that slowed labor during the hottest hours of the day. The railway needed more locomotives, stronger bridges, and a disciplined scheduling system capable of handling wartime loads. Warehouses were inadequate, sidings too short, and customs processes outdated for fast-moving cargo. What the Allies needed was not just access, they needed transformation. The United States watched closely. Though not yet at war in August and September, American officials already saw Lend-Lease as a key part of their strategy to support the embattled Soviet Union. If the Arctic convoy route failed, or Vladivostok remained constrained by Japanese pressure, the Persian Gulf might become the only reliable route for sending trucks, aircraft parts, munitions, and food northward. By late 1941, debates in Washington circulated about assigning U.S. forces to the region to rebuild its logistics. The decision would take months, but the groundwork for American involvement had already begun. Meanwhile, life inside Iran shifted in quieter but no less important ways. Cities absorbed waves of Allied personnel, while rural communities near the rail line watched unfamiliar convoys cross landscapes long shaped by their own rhythm. Iranian railway workers, mechanics, and laborers found themselves at the center of an international supply chain they had never imagined. Inflation crept up as demand for food, housing, and transport rose. The war had not come as battles to most of Iran, but it arrived as pressure constant, heavy, and reshaping routines. Despite the instability, a kind of operational baseline emerged by December. The Allies could move goods, but only slowly, and only with continual problem-solving. Bottlenecks formed at ports, then at rail junctions, then again at the Caspian Sea. Each improvement revealed the next weakness. British and Indian engineers expanded facilities where they could, but the gap between need and capacity kept widening. The Soviet Union required more than the corridor could yet provide. Still, the invasion had created the conditions for a solution, though one that demanded unusual levels of cooperation, investment, and engineering improvisation. The Allies had secured the territory, stabilized the political environment, and obtained the transport rights they needed. Now they had to overcome geography itself. Mountains that strained locomotives, deserts that baked machinery, and ports not designed for the incoming flood of wartime cargo. As winter approached, Tehran, Ahvaz, Basra, and the ports of the Caspian formed a single question that shaped Allied strategy. Could this overstretched railway, clinging to mountain slopes and winding through narrow gorges, be rebuilt into a supply artery the Red Army could truly depend on? The answer would define the next phase of the war and the transformation of Iran's role within it. The first bottleneck was not the mountains or the railway, it was the water itself. In late 1941, as Allied planners assessed how much aid could practically enter Iran, they found that the Persian Gulf ports were already under strain even in peacetime. Khorramshahr and Bandar Shahpur sat at the edge of shallow tidal channels, where large ships were reluctant to approach and smaller vessels lined up for space. Heat climbed past 45 degrees Celsius in the summer months, forcing laborers to work in shorter shifts or at night. For a route expected to help sustain a nation fighting for its life, this was a weak beginning. Khorramshahr became the early testing ground. British and Indian Army engineers arriving in the autumn of 1941 reported cranes that could barely lift the growing weight of Lend-Lease cargo, warehouses already filled to capacity, and berths too limited for the incoming volume. Bandar Shahpur, though well placed at the end of the Trans-Iranian railway, faced similar limits. Its docks were adequate for regional trade, not for tens of thousands of tons of wartime equipment arriving each month. Even before the sharp increase in Allied shipping began, both ports were nearing their working limits. To steady the situation, British-led teams launched a program of quick fixes. They deepened the channels to allow deeper draft ships to approach. They installed temporary docks, expanded shelving, reinforced storage sheds, and rearranged traffic to reduce unloading delays. Maintenance crews worked through nights lit by lamps and welding sparks, trying to keep machinery functional in the extreme heat. Indian dockworkers, experienced in port systems across the empire, became a key workforce, managing cargo flows that demanded precision despite very hard conditions. Still, the improvements were not enough. The Soviet Union's needs were rising faster than the ports could adapt. By late 1942, as Stalingrad reached its breaking point, Allied expectations for the Persian corridor shot up. Tonnage targets that had initially been set at 30,000 tons per month soon tripled. London and Washington knew that failure in Iran could weaken the Eastern Front. Every month of delay threatened to spread outward into disastrous consequences. It was in this moment of growing urgency that the United States entered the scene. With the formation of the U.S. Army Persian Gulf Command in November 1942, the ports experienced a shift from makeshift repairs to reorganization across the whole system. American officers introduced standard unloading procedures drawn from industrial port management, strict schedules, cargo categorization, round-the-clock operations, and an emphasis on cutting wasted time. Their approach did not replace the work done by British and Indian engineers, but added new levels of control to infrastructure already under heavy strain. One of the most visible changes came through machinery. TERS. Built cranes, hoists, and forklifts arrived in large numbers, increasing lifting capacity by 3- or 4-fold. With greater machine help, unloading that had once taken days could be completed in hours. Dockworkers, Iranian, Indian, British, and American, adapted to new rhythms. Cargo nets rising and falling in quick sequence. Trucks lining up for immediate transfer to depots. Clerks racing to match manifests with coded supply batches. What had been a slow, heat-limited port began to look like an industrial engine. But growth came with consequences for those living nearby. Housing shortages worsened as Allied personnel crowded into Khorramshahr and Abadan. Rent prices soared. Local merchants gained from new markets, yet inflation stretched household budgets. Water and electricity systems strained under the sudden population increase. In some districts, residents complained of noise from the docks continuing past midnight. Iran was not simply hosting a logistical operation, it was taking on the social and economic pressures that came with it. Despite these strains, progress was clear. By mid-1943, Khorramshahr and Bandar Shahpur were moving cargo at rates hard to imagine just 18 months earlier. Rows of Studebaker trucks, crated aircraft parts, ammunition boxes, railway rails, and drums of aviation fuel passed through the ports at a speed that matched the urgency of events thousands of kilometers away. Every ton unloaded meant one more shipment that could help keep the Soviet front from collapsing. Yet the ports remained only the first link in a longer chain. As soon as cargo left the docks, it faced its next challenge. A railway system built for a young, developing country, now expected to carry the weight of two global empires. Schedules tightened, locomotives multiplied, and pressure intensified at the Avaz junction, where the freight pushed inland. As traffic volume grew, so did the risk of disruption. A breakdown at the docks no longer affected only local operations. It threatened the entire flow of supplies from the Gulf to the Caucasus. By late 1943, the ports had reached a kind of organized chaos, a system that could hold under pressure but never truly relax. The cranes were busy, the warehouses full, and the convoys non-stop. But the real test still lay ahead. To meet the tonnage goals set by the Red Army, the Trans-Iranian Railway would have to absorb volumes far beyond its original design capacity. The ports could push. The mountains would decide how much they could truly carry. And so, even as the Gulf's bottleneck eased, a new uncertainty emerged inland. The question was no longer whether ships could unload fast enough, but whether the narrow railway running through Iran's rugged interior could be turned into the backbone of a wartime lifeline, or whether it would bend and break under the growing weight of Allied expectations. The answer would define the next struggle of the corridor. A railway created to unify a nation now faced the strain of sustaining an entire front. When the Allies turned inland from the ports, they confronted a truth Tehran had long understood. The Trans-Iranian Railway was a masterpiece of ambition, but it was not built for war on a global scale. Its steep gradients, tight curves, and mountain tunnels reflected Iranian engineering pride, yet they also imposed limits that no amount of optimism could erase. And in 1942, as Allied cargo surged northward, those limits became painfully clear. The line wound from the Gulf at Bandar Shahpur up through Avaz, climbed the Zagros range toward Andimeshk, and descended again toward Tehran and the Caspian. Its gradients reached 2.8% in places steep enough to reduce locomotive power and force trains to crawl. Tunnels, some drilled in haste during the 1930s, suffered from ventilation problems that worsened in summer. Bridges, though sturdy, were never meant to carry the constant weight of wartime freight. The railway symbolized independence under Reza Shah, but it had been built under financial strain and political urgency, resulting in infrastructure that valued national unity over heavy industrial traffic. When British and Indian engineering teams assessed the line in late 1941, their reports described a system that could carry modest civilian loads, but not the rising demands of Lend-Lease. Sidings were too short to take long wartime trains. brake systems overheated on descents, locomotive fleets were small and aging. The railway could function as a corridor, but only with major modernization, and every month lost in upgrades meant Soviet armies went without crucial equipment. By 1942, as the United States formally entered the logistical effort, the transformation began. American railway specialists arrived with a clear mission: turn a fragile national line into a wartime conveyor. They brought with them new diesel locomotives, hundreds of freight cars, and powerful 280 steam engines capable of handling mountain grades far better than the existing fleet. Workshops expanded in Avaz and Tehran, where Iranian mechanics, now working alongside American and British technicians, learned to maintain equipment under relentless scheduling. Yet even with stronger locomotives, the railway required new operating methods. Train dispatchers developed fresh traffic patterns, including double-heading using two engines to pull a single heavy load up steep inclines. Night operations increased to avoid the heat that warped rails and strained boilers. Mountain braking teams monitored vulnerable sections where derailment risk increased each summer. Ventilation in key tunnels was improved with temporary fans, though crews still emerged from them covered in soot and gas. These changes did not happen in isolation. They were the work of thousands of people: railwaymen, labourers, students, villagers, and foreign specialists who found themselves woven into a logistical network whose purpose lay far beyond Iran's borders. Many Iranian workers took pride in the modernization, seeing in it an expansion of skills and technology. Others saw exhaustion, disruption, and the growing presence of foreign soldiers. For most, it was both. Opportunity and intrusion mixed together in the rhythms of wartime necessity. By mid-1943, the railway's capacity had risen sharply. Records from the period describe months in which more than 100,000 tons moved reliably across the mountains, a rate hard to imagine just 2 years earlier. Freight trains snaked through gorges day and night, their headlights cutting through dust and darkness, their whistles echoing across valleys that had never seen such volumes of traffic. Avaz became a logistical heartbeat, where cargo from the Gulf was organized into convoys for the long climb north. The morale shift was real. What had once seemed an unlikely project, turning a young nation's railway into a strategic artery, was becoming reality. Every improvement fed into the next. Stronger locomotives allowed longer trains. Longer trains demanded better scheduling, and better scheduling reduced bottlenecks at ports and depots. The system still had weaknesses, but it was no longer fragile. Still, the mountain line's success created its own pressures. As the railway proved capable of carrying higher tonnages, Soviet expectations rose in step. Moscow saw the corridor not just as an alternative route, but as a lifeline that could help stabilize fronts, stretching from the Caucasus to the Volga. The Red Army's needs expanded after the crisis of Stalingrad, and with them grew the demand for an uninterrupted flow of trucks, weapons, fuel, and food. The question shifted from whether the railway could operate at all to whether it could handle wartime surges without breaking down. Technical challenges continued. Summer heat kept threatening derailments. Dust storms forced emergency delays. Tunnels needed constant monitoring. Bridges showed stress under the new load patterns. Iranian communities along the line experienced traffic that changed the sound and pace of daily life. Every day brought a new calculation, a new adjustment, a new test of resilience. Yet the railway held. Through 1943, it became the backbone of the Persian corridor, the artery that proved the port's expansions were meaningful, and that the road networks could support but not replace the steady rhythm of steel wheels on mountain tracks. It was now not just a railway but a tool of global strategy. But success only raised the stakes. With each month of increased volume, the Allied command planned for even greater loads, and as the line approached its limits, planners knew that overcoming one bottleneck only shifted the pressure to the next. The mountains had been mastered for now, but peak Lend-Lease still lay ahead. and the corridor was about to face its most demanding test: the need for speed, flexibility, and improvisation across every route that tied the Gulf to the Soviet South. That test would come not from the rails alone, but from the roads, rivers, and emergency measures waiting beyond the horizon. When locomotives strained, when tunnels filled with heat, or when a single derailment threatened to ripple through the whole system, the burden shifted to Iran's roads. These were not highways built for mass freight. They were winding, dust-filled lifelines connecting the Gulf to the plateau, running through mountain passes that challenged even experienced drivers. Yet in the years between 1942 and 1944, these roads patched, widened, rerouted, and reworked often saved the Persian corridor's timetable. The Ahvaz-Tehran route became the most crucial of these overland arteries. In peacetime, it supported commercial traffic and provincial travel. In wartime, it became the backup for stalled trains, overflow cargo, and priority equipment that could not wait for a cleared track. Convoys of Studebaker US 6 trucks, among the most recognizable symbols of Lend-Lease, crawled along the route, their engines coughing in the heat, their tires carving deep grooves into the earth. Each convoy required planning that looked like a military campaign: spacing to avoid dust blindness, radio checks, coordination of water stops, and a constant watch for landslides. The environment itself became a powerful enemy. Summer heat could warp road surfaces and overheat engines. Dust storms reduced visibility to a few meters. Winter rains triggered landslides that buried sections of the mountain corridor between Andimeshk and Kazvin. Iranian labor, crews, roadmen, villagers, hired contractors cleared debris with tools ranging from bulldozers to shovels, often working on slopes so unstable that another slide could sweep over them without warning. Their work rarely entered official reports, yet without it, the corridor would have broken apart each rainy season. American engineers expanded and strengthened key stretches of the road system. They laid culverts to control runoff, reinforced embankments, and introduced all-weather surfaces where possible. They increased the number of rest stops and repair depots, built small radio stations, and established procedures linking truck convoys to railway schedules. The improvements did not remove danger, but they reduced unpredictability, turning improvised routes into fairly reliable logistical corridors. Alongside the roads, Iran's rivers added their own limited but valuable support. The Shat al-Arab, which links Basra and Khorramshahr, served as both an advantage and a challenge. Its waters allowed barges to ferry cargo between depots when roads became impassable, or ports backed up, but its channels shifted with the seasons. Its depth changed, and wartime traffic added to the congestion. Barge shortages became constant. At times, Allied officers searched for vessels across multiple markets, leasing whatever floated: commercial tugs, aging barges, fishing craft rebuilt for cargo. Anything that could carry supplies became part of the corridor's improvised fleet. Every mode of transport, truck, barge, or train, depended on the others. When railway tunnels needed ventilation repairs, truck convoys took over. When roads washed out, barges absorbed overflow. When the Shat al-Arab's capacity dropped, trains took on extra loads. The entire system became a living network of substitutions, in which delays in one sector triggered quick adjustments in others. This flexibility, more than any single engineering feat, kept the corridor working through its most vulnerable periods. The human side of these improvisations was huge. Thousands of Iranian drivers were brought into Allied service, or worked for Iranian companies supporting the operation. They drove unfamiliar American trucks, navigated foreign command structures, and worked under time pressures that left little room for rest. Some welcomed the opportunity, seeing steady wages and new skills. Others endured exhaustion, rough treatment, or fear as convoys wound through isolated stretches where a single breakdown could leave them exposed for hours. Cultural misunderstandings were common, but most drivers experienced on Iran's difficult terrain became essential partners to American and British planners. Villages along the convoy routes changed almost overnight. Tea stalls multiplied. Mechanics opened roadside workshops. Schoolyards filled with passing trucks. In some areas, noise and dust disrupted farming routines. In others, the arrival of work offered short-term prosperity. Iran was not merely a backdrop, it was a system of communities in motion, adapting to a corridor laid across their landscapes. As the corridor approached its peak years, improvisation became routine. Engineers built temporary bridges to bypass weak spans. Convoy commanders staggered departures to avoid bottlenecks at mountain passes. Iranian contractors recruited additional drivers for nighttime hauling, where cooler temperatures protected engines. In emergencies, Allied teams even rerouted cargo to parallel tracks or alternate roads built on short notice. By 1943, the combined effect of these systems was unmistakable. Iran's interior no longer contained a single supply route, but a multi-layered network: roads, rails, barges, depots, workshops, and repair stations that could adapt to changing pressures. It was not perfect, but it was resilient, flexible, and increasingly tied into a regional strategy whose importance grew with each Soviet counteroffensive. And yet, the corridor was only now reaching its true test. The Soviet Union's needs were rising sharply. Allied planners, reacting to the changing pace of the Eastern Front, prepared for record shipments of trucks, food, weapons, and fuel. What had once seemed ambitious, tens of thousands of tons per month, would soon seem modest. The logistical machinery built across Iran was about to face the full weight of wartime demand. The mountains had been crossed, and the roads had proven their worth. But the next phase would push every part, ports, rails, convoys, ferries, and personnel, to their absolute limit. The question was no longer whether the system could function. It was whether it could speed up enough to help shift the balance of the entire war. The answer would come in the corridor's peak years, when Iran carried more than 300,000 tons of aid each month toward the Eastern Front, and when the war's outcome grew increasingly tied to the rhythm of trains and trucks crossing its rugged interior. By 1943, the Persian corridor had shifted from an ambitious logistical experiment into a critical artery of the Allied war effort. The turning point came in the months following Stalingrad, when the Soviet Union's urgent need for supplies reached levels unmatched by any earlier phase of the conflict. Trucks, canned food, aviation fuel, medical supplies, rails, and munitions, millions of tons were suddenly required not just to hold the line, but to support counter-offensives stretching from the Caucasus to the Dnieper. The question was simple and enormous. Could Iran carry the weight? The answer depended on coordination. Ports had to operate continuously, with cranes swinging through the night. Rail dispatchers needed perfect timing to avoid bottlenecks in narrow mountain sections. Truck convoys had to depart at exact intervals, matched with train arrivals in Ahvaz, Kazvin, and Tehran. Anything less than discipline across the whole system risked slowing deliveries that the Red Army depended on for survival. And by mid-1943, the system was finally ready to attempt what had once seemed impossible. At the center of this transformation stood the U.S. Army Persian Gulf Command, led by General Donald H. Connolly. His officers brought large-scale industrial logistics to the Gulf, setting up procedures shaped in American factories and rail hubs. Timed loading cycles, standard cargo categories, continuous maintenance routines, and strict record-keeping. Labor forces, British, Indian, Iranian, American, worked in shifts that erased the difference between day and night. Each port became a non-stop choreography of cranes, trucks, and whistles, where a single hour of delay echoed across an entire continent. The Soviets, too, strengthened their role. Caspian shipping became a finely tuned extension of the corridor. Soviet-operated ferries and barges received cargo at Bandar Anzali and Bandar Shah, often departing within hours of unloading. From there, goods moved northward along rail networks that ran toward the Volga, the Don, and the southern fronts. Equipment that reached Soviet ports in March could be in use at the front by April. The speed built into this system, Gulf to Caucasus to battlefield, gave the Red Army flexibility it had lacked in earlier stages of the war. The most symbolic cargo of these peak years was the Studebaker truck. Crated in American factories, shipped across the Gulf, hauled by rail through Iran, ferried across the Caspian, and assembled in the Soviet interior, these trucks became the backbone of Soviet mobility. Reports noted that they allowed artillery units to reposition quickly and motorized brigades to keep their pace across vast distances. Each vehicle that rumbled north through Iran carried the potential to change a battle hundreds of miles away. Food supplies, too, carried meaning beyond their weight. Canned meat and packaged rations flowed through Iran in huge quantities, ensuring that Soviet soldiers had steady nutrition, even as agricultural regions remained devastated by occupation and scorched earth tactics. Aviation gasoline, carefully handled and escorted, fed the engines of the aircraft defending Soviet cities and backing ground attacks. Medical supplies saved lives at a scale rarely mentioned outside specialist histories. The corridor was not just a logistical achievement, it was a lifeline that deeply affected the human side of the war. By late 1943 and throughout 1944, the numbers reached their peak. Monthly volume over 300,000 tons became the new standard, with a combined total that archival records place between 4.0 and 4.2 million tons across the entire war. This volume did not flow smoothly. It pulsed, surged, and strained the system at every level. Trains queued at sidings, convoys bunched on mountain roads, barges crowded the Caspian docks. Yet somehow, through constant adaptation, the system held. Iran's landscape absorbed the results of this intensity. Cities along the routes grew louder and more crowded. Inflation continued, wages rose unevenly, and shortages of housing and consumer goods frustrated local families. But at the same time, technical skills expanded. Iranian workers mastered locomotive maintenance, American-style bookkeeping, heavy machinery operation, and advanced repair techniques. Workshops that had once handled small loads now worked like wartime factories. Iran's economy felt the strain, but also glimpsed an industrial future that would outlast the war. For Allied planners, the corridor's success changed long-standing assumptions. Early critics had doubted whether Iran, with its limited pre-war infrastructure, could ever serve as a major supply artery. Yet, by 1944, its volume rivaled that of more established logistical routes. The Arctic convoys remained vital but dangerous. Pacific routes were limited by Japanese pressure. In contrast, Iran offered a land bridge protected from submarines and shielded from the most volatile naval theaters. Its reliability made it indispensable, and still, beneath this achievement, tensions simmered. Iran's government watched the Allied build-up with growing unease. British and American approaches sometimes clashed, and Soviet expectations kept expanding. Rumors spread in Tehran's political circles about what post-war influence each foreign power wanted. The success of the corridor increased Iran's value, but also raised new worries about its sovereignty. As 1944 went on, the tide of battle was turning in Europe, and the Soviet Union pushed westward with renewed confidence. Victory seemed closer, yet the politics around Iran grew more complicated with each passing month. If the corridor had once stood for logistical cooperation, it now also represented competing visions of influence and control. The war's greatest deliveries were being achieved, but they came with a question that no amount of cargo could answer. When the guns finally fell silent, what would Iran's role be in a world shaped by three triumphant yet increasingly cautious allies? That question would soon move from the logistics yards to the halls of diplomacy, pulling the corridor into the shadows of political struggle. Even as trains roared north and convoys wound their way through mountain passes, another current flowed beneath the Persian corridor, one shaped not by tonnage, but by politics. By 1943, Iran had become more than a logistical artery. It was a battleground of influence between three uneasy allies whose cooperation rested on military need, not mutual trust. And for Iran itself, the war years posed a deeper question. What did sovereignty mean under occupation? The shift became clear during the Tehran Conference of November-December 1943. As Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin met in the Iranian capital, their presence sent a symbolic message. Iran mattered. The joint communiqué affirmed its independence and promised economic help. Yet beneath the diplomatic language lay a reality visible to anyone walking the streets of Tehran. Foreign troops filled the city. Supply depots grew at their edges, and discussions inside government buildings increasingly focused on how long the Allies intended to stay. Daily life reflected this tension. Inflation rose sharply as Allied demand for housing, food, and transportation outpaced supply. Tehran's markets saw prices climb week after week. Laborers earned more, but soaring rents and shortages ate away their wages. Black markets thrived while rationing systems struggled to keep up with population pressure. Rural communities near railway lines watched their grain and livestock move toward Allied requisitions rather than domestic markets. The sense of economic disruption fed public frustration and sharpened political debate. In the Majlis, nationalist voices grew louder. Lawmakers questioned the behavior of occupying forces, criticized the strain placed on local populations, and warned of the dangers of foreign influence in northern provinces. Soviet soldiers stationed in Azerbaijan were viewed with particular unease. Their presence, combined with Moscow's interest in oil concessions, raised fears that the northern occupation zone might drift toward greater Soviet control once the war ended. Reports of political organizing in Tabriz and Rasht further deepened suspicions. The British and Americans, while working with the Soviets in logistics, approached Iran's internal politics differently. British officials, drawing on decades of regional involvement, often acted with caution to maintain stability. American officers, newer to Iran and less tied to imperial traditions, expressed sympathy for Iranian calls for sovereignty and economic reform. These contrasting attitudes sometimes produced friction within the Allied command. Decisions about labor practices, pay, or resource allocation could spark disagreements that showed how fragile the partnership really was. Meanwhile, Iran's young monarch, Mohammad Reza Shah, tried to navigate the uncertainty with limited leverage. His government relied on Allied goodwill for political security, yet every concession risked weakening his standing at home. He pressed for clearer withdrawal timelines, raised concerns over economic stress, and tried to present Iran as a cooperative but sovereign partner. But tension remained. The war required the corridor to keep expanding, and expansion required a level of Allied control that strained Iran's autonomy. By 1944, with the end of the war in sight, new complexities emerged rather than relief. As Allied victory became more likely, debates sharpened over what would happen when the fighting stopped. Britain and the United States signaled they intended to leave. The Soviet Union's position was less clear. Though Moscow had signed agreements promising eventual departure, its actions in northern Iran, supporting local political movements, delaying administrative handovers, and exploring oil concessions suggested a wish to keep its influence. These uncertainties filtered down into daily talk. In bazaars and cafes, people wondered whether the Allies would keep their promises. In provincial towns, rumors spread of changing borders or new administrations. Government ministers quietly worried that the balance of power shaping their country during the war might harden into something more permanent afterwards. And still, through all of this, the corridor pushed forward. Supplies continued to flow at record levels. Workshops in Avaz hummed through the night. Barges crossed the Caspian in steady cycles. The war effort did not pause for political tension. Nor did political tension stop the war effort. The two currents ran together, each shaping the other in ways not always visible to those loading crates or repairing boilers. But by the final year of the war, the underlying conflict between logistical necessity and national sovereignty could no longer remain in the shadows. As the guns began to fall silent across Europe, The question that had hung in the air since 1941 returned with force. When would the foreign troops leave, and perhaps more urgently, would they all leave? Iran's wartime transformation had brought modern machinery, expanded skills, and global recognition. But it had also brought competing ambitions to its soil. Once the supply trains stopped and the urgency of war faded, those ambitions would clash directly. The corridor's last challenge was approaching quickly, one not defined by tonnage or terrain, but by the struggle over who controlled the rails once victory arrived. With victory declared in 1945, the engines that had driven the Persian corridor began to slow. The urgency that once pushed every port, crane, barge, and locomotive no longer defined daily life. But for Iran, the end of the war did not bring instant relief. Instead, it opened a new struggle, one shaped by withdrawal deadlines, political pressure, and the question of who would control the infrastructure that had been transformed under Allied hands. The process of handing over locomotives, depots, and ports began almost as soon as the war ended. Workshops in Ahvaz and Tehran, once staffed by American and British technicians, shifted gradually toward Iranian control. Equipment lists were compiled, checked, and renegotiated. Some locomotives were bought outright, others were handed back under agreements made with the United States. Railway teams that had spent years working alongside foreign supervisors now took charge of systems stretched to levels hard to imagine before 1941. Yet even as the U.S. and Britain prepared to leave, the northern zone remained unsettled. The Soviet Union delayed its withdrawal beyond the expected timeline, citing logistical complications, regional instability, and talks over oil concessions. In Azerbaijan, political groups backed by Soviet influence declared autonomous structures that Tehran saw as unacceptable attacks on its sovereignty. The crisis that followed drew international attention, becoming one of the first major diplomatic confrontations of the new post-war world. For Iran, the stakes were fundamental. The wartime occupation had already strained its economy and tested its political legitimacy. Now, as Allied unity broke apart globally, Tehran faced the possibility that part of its territory might be held indefinitely. The government appealed to the United Nations, one of the earliest examples of the institution being used to handle international disputes. Diplomatic pressure mounted, and by May 1946, Soviet troops completed their withdrawal, easing immediate fears but leaving lasting suspicion. As control returned fully to Iranian hands, the country faced the immediate aftermath of logistical transformation. Inflation, which had climbed throughout the war, needed to be brought under control. Housing shortages continued in port cities and railway towns. Labor forces trained in wartime workshops searched for jobs in a peacetime economy that could not absorb everyone at once. Yet there were clear gains as well. Modernized ports, expanded technical expertise, and a railway system whose abilities far exceeded its pre-war state. These improvements did not come without problems. Some communities saw wartime projects as engines of growth. Others saw them as disruptions forced on them without consultation. For policymakers, the challenge lay in turning a wartime supply artery into a base for national development. The Trans-Iranian Railway, once criticized as too steep and too expensive, now served as a backbone for commercial transport. Ports such as Khorramshahr retained machinery and infrastructure to support trade long after the last Allied ship left. Even the road systems, patched and reinforced out of wartime necessity, offered new routes for internal connection. Yet the memory of occupation cast a long shadow. Many Iranians remembered the strain of shortages, the presence of foreign troops in their cities, and the uncertainty over whether the great powers meant to leave. Others remembered opportunity, new skills, new wages, and a glimpse of a more industrial future. As these stories differed, one truth remained constant. The war had permanently changed how Iran saw itself and how the world saw Iran. Globally, the Persian corridor faded into relative obscurity. The Arctic convoys, with their dangerous journeys through ice and submarine-infested waters, captured public imagination. The vast Pacific supply routes dominated strategic histories. In contrast, the slow, steady flow of goods through Iran, undisturbed by storms or U-boats, measured by tonnage rather than drama, remained largely overlooked. Yet for historians and logisticians, the corridor stood as proof that engineering, organization, and diplomacy could change the course of a distant battlefield. By the time the last foreign troops left and Iran regained complete operational control, the corridor had become something more than a wartime route. It was a symbol of how global conflict could reshape a nation, showing both weakness and resilience. Its rails had carried more than cargo. They had carried the weight of alliances, ambitions, and the first tremors of the post-war Middle East. The supply line closed, but its consequences kept echoing. For the Soviet Union, the millions of tons delivered across Iran had helped support armies that pushed to Berlin. For the Western Allies, the corridor showed the power of infrastructure as a tool of strategy. For Iran, it marked a turning point between forced involvement and growing independence, an experience that shaped political life long after the last locomotive returned to civilian service. And so the Persian corridor's long shadow stretched beyond 1946, reaching into debates about sovereignty, modernization, and memory. The war had ended, but the tracks it laid across Iran would guide more than freight. They would guide the first outlines of a post-war order still in the making. Stay curious about the hidden arteries that shaped World War II. There are countless untold stories just like this one. Join the channel for more deep dives into the forgotten logistics, battles, and decisions that changed history. Like, subscribe, and share to help these overlooked chapters reach every history fan who deserves to know them.